Hey, Twin Cities Startup Week. Welcome to today's panel. We're going to talk about how early stage startups and startups in general can engage with large corporations in the food system. I'm Brett Bohl. I'm going to be moderating our panel today. Really excited to have Meredith and Dominique here with us. I'm the managing director of the Techstars Farm to Fork Accelerator and one of the managing partners of Bread and Butter Ventures, an early stage venture capital fund. And I'm going to let Meredith and Dominique introduce themselves. Meredith, give your.
Hi, my name is Meredith Englund. I'm the VP of Water Partnerships at Ecolab. I actually worked on the Techstars Farm to Fork Accelerator when we were first starting up. Ecolab works in multiple areas within the food and ag industry, everywhere from dairy farms to food and beverage manufacturing to food retail and restaurants. And so we are very excited about the food and ag startup community, and I'm happy to be here today.
Dominique.
Perfect. Hi there, Dominique Harris. I am the strategy and business development lead for Cargill's global alternative proteins team. Prior to this role, I actually worked with our Protein North America team in Growth Ventures, where a lot of my day-to-day and responsibilities centered around building and maintaining relationships between startups, accelerators, incubators, venture capitalists. So I am thrilled to be on the panel today. Broadly speaking, Cargill is very engaged with investing along the entire supply chain, so ranging from agri-tech to ingredient tech to food tech. So really look forward to engaging with the team today.
Awesome. Thanks both of you for those backgrounds. And another thing you both have in common is you're both giant enterprises. You are not small companies, right? Thousands, tens of thousands of employees, huge P&Ls, huge balance sheets, and startups often are trying to sell to you, trying to sell you their product for biz dev, they're trying to get investment. And so I want to dive in and have both of you answer, and maybe Dominique can go first this time. Like, is there a right stage or a time, like what stage of company, startup-wise, when should they start talking to you? Is there something you think about in that world?
Yeah, I think as we look at agriculture and as we look at the startup world, I think it's really relationship driven. So I would say there isn't a area where it's too early to engage with Cargill, but I think really being intentional on what you want from that relationship. So you don't have products on the market or you're just starting up with this great idea, I think that there's an opportunity to work with Cargill and work with some of our employees as mentors to help you navigate that space. I can tell you from where I've sat, we tend to look at Series A and beyond, but it's been really cool to get to know startups when they're in their pre-seed or seed round, because you also get a chance to see their development over the years. And once again, we say it often at Cargill, we invest in people, right? We invest in technology, of course, but we also invest in people. And so the sooner you can get that rapport or that engagement and really work on nourishing that relationship, I would say the better.
Yeah, I would actually echo a lot of the same thoughts that Dominique laid out, which is, I think the most critical thing when you're engaging with a corporate player is knowing what it is that you want out of that relationship and having a very clear ask. And it doesn't need to be the final place that you end up in a relationship with that company. It just needs to be a really good hypothesis to go in. I think where we've run into challenges with really early stage startups in the past is when they come in and they say, hey, we've got this cool thing. What do you think you can do with it? And depending on who you're speaking to at the company, that might not be an exercise that they're familiar with, right? And so it really helps to kind of come in with a hypothesis, even if it's wrong, to give people at a large company something to react to and something that they can sink their teeth into and kind of imagine as a potential relationship with you. I agree with Dominique that it doesn't matter what stage you are. There are ways that both corporations and startups can benefit from relationships between those two entities early on, all the way through later stage. And so I would encourage you to go ahead and reach out, just making sure that you have an initial hypothesis in mind.
And just to quickly add on, Meredith, I think you made a really good point when you said, hey, be very clear on what you want to get out of this relationship. I think as a startup, if you're coming to a big corporation, really being able to connect the dots on where your innovation fits in with that corporation, or how your innovation can add value to that corporation. Coming in with that thought process, I think it is phenomenal, because it shows that you've done your research and your homework, and you truly are ready to engage with a big conglomerate like Cargill.
Yeah, and we've certainly seen that with our program, with the TechStars program, with both of your all's organizations, where the companies that have an idea, at least, of where they think they can start, it just kind of speeds up that timeline a little bit, right? We'll talk about enterprise cycles taking forever. If you started off as this founder, you can almost accelerate that timeline a little bit. One thing that, there's a couple of things I want to unpack that you both mentioned. Dominique, you mentioned Series A for investment, and you both kind of said you're stage agnostic as far as when to start having those conversations. Is there a difference between when they should be talking to you for investment versus when they should be talking to you for partnerships, or selling into an enterprise? And either one of you, whoever wants to jump in first.
Yeah, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Brad, but I think when you're at seed stage, it's very unlikely that you have a commercialized product that you're bringing to market. And so I think the greatest value for the startup is kind of that mentorship, that that information and knowledge transfer from big corporations. And honestly, at that point, what's super valuable for me and my role is understanding the technology that's out there, right? Like what's around the corner, what's new and innovative, and having that on my radar as we continue to see startups grow and evolve. For me, that's the biggest value that you get. And so when you get to a Series A, you now know the company, you know the founder, you know the basis of their technology, kind of their overall journey, and it's a storytelling operation, right? Like you get people to believe in your story and believe in your technology, and I think it's I think as you do that, the commercial opportunities around investment or selling in, I think that becomes a little bit easier.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that just with kind of a cursory, internet research, you can often find a lot about a company's investment thesis and what stage of companies they invest in and in what areas. And if not, I would highly encourage you to reach out to the startup community within the community that the company you're targeting is part of, right? So in the Twin Cities, we have a really vibrant startup community. A lot of the players within this community understand what stage startups different companies would consider for what types of investments or what types of engagement. And so they can kind of help you navigate that. Rather than ending up in a situation where you're asking for something that's probably not going to pan out. That said, Ecolab has made a series of investments in all sorts of stages of companies. I mean, definitely not as early as kind of the angel investing scenario. You definitely need to have kind of a product or something that's pilotable at the very least. But again, I think that the startup community can be really helpful in helping you navigate that.
Yeah, and it's not no different from doing research on venture funds, right? Like for pure financial investors, right? You should, as a founder, anytime you approach anybody for investment, do your research first. Understand what stage they like to invest, or the verticals they like to invest in. The more research you can do, the better chance you're going to have at getting investments. And I don't think that's any difference from corporate venture capital or traditional. Something else that's come up a bunch of times already is reach out. Those conversations. How the heck do I do that? I'm a founder. Like, there's thousands of you. We should be able to find you, but who do I reach out to, and like how do I get them to respond to me to have a conversation?
Again, I would highly recommend leveraging the startup communities, right? So if you were to reach out to someone in the Twin Cities startup community, right? So think of Techstars, Beta MN, some of the organizations in town that work with startups as their purpose, they often know the people at different companies that are the good filters into the company that understand kind of how to direct those reach outs. If you end up doing kind of random hits on LinkedIn or anything along those lines, it's going to be hard. I mean, so my title is VP of Water Partnerships right now. You would probably not find me on LinkedIn, but I'd probably be a good in to speak to at Ecolab if you're a startup that's looking to engage with us. You probably couldn't, you'd have a hard time figuring that out from my LinkedIn, which probably says something about my LinkedIn profile and what I should be doing on it. But at the same time, if you were to reach out to Brett or Beta MN or some of the groups in town, you would probably find me relatively quickly. The other thing is that when you have that warm intro, it's more likely to break through in my inbox. I'm more likely to feel somewhat obligated to reply in some way, right? Because someone passed you along to me and I have a relationship with that person. And that person can follow up with me and nag me if I never responded, because either it got buried in my inbox or because I completely forgot about it. So it's really beneficial to have that warm intro. I know that makes getting that intro harder, but that's why I would encourage people to really think about networking within the startup community as much as possible.
My story is going to be, hey, Brett, I thought you know all the right people to get in touch with. But Meredith, agree. You hit it the nail on the head. When you talked about this, the power of networking, right? And so knowing who's connected at these companies, I think when you have a Brett or Techstars, they know the key players at these companies, and those key players can pretty much tap into the overarching ecosystem, which can be very confusing if you're not in the belly of the beast. But yeah, and I think it's also super important to tap into conferences, tap into events and engagements where you have a lot of like-minded people, because I swear you talk about 6 degrees of separation. I think in food tech or food and ag tech is where like 2 or 3 degrees, if that. So I think people tend to understate and undersell their network, but really leaning into those personal connections and leaning into people who can really do the heavy lifting of following up and nagging people when need to. I think there's something to be said about that.
That's awesome. I have a feeling that you two are going to be getting a lot of emails after this after this one. Which is
unfortunately, we just gave you permission to nag us for follow-up.
We did.
So I feel pretty good about, if nothing else, I feel pretty good about that. All right, let's pretend that we get in, we're a startup, we get in, we have an opportunity to do a sales meeting, right? And we're trying to sell to an Ecolab or a Cargill from a biz dev perspective. Like, can you walk through a little bit like what that process would look like from on a decision-making side for an Ecolab or a Cargill? Like, who needs to sign off on it? How long does it take? Why or why not would you agree to doing a pilot or a POC with a startup? Can we walk through a little bit of like the details of what to, like let's peel back the curtain a little bit, which is a bit of a black box, and talk a little bit about that portion of it. Meredith, you want to dive in?
I was going to give Dominique this one.
No, go for it.
Yeah, so a couple things to think about. One is that inherently for a corporation, doing a POC or a pilot with a startup is going to feel riskier, right? And so that's the biggest challenge that you're walking into. And keep in mind that that includes that all of our internal processes are set up with the assumption that we're not working with a startup on whatever technology it is, right? So that's kind of what you're up against. Keeping that in mind, what you need to do is you need to really think about kind of the stakeholder management within a company, right? And you've got to find your advocates that are really it's going to be worth it enough for them to go through the rigmarole of, bypassing processes to get the POC or the pilot accomplished, right? And so you've really got to be thoughtful about making sure that you have a really good relationship and that you're giving them ammo to be using internally to help them make their job easier of getting the pilot or POC approved. And that ammo is really going to be about kind of your classic business case, right? What's the value that you're creating? What is that value worth in dollars? What's the, and what's your pricing and what's the differential, right? And if that story is compelling enough, then it's easier to kind of move things through. And so just getting to that really clear pencil map is really helpful in getting the right people on board quickly.
Yeah, I think it's all about driving confidence that at the end of a POC or at the end of a pilot, both the startup and the corporation would have gained something from this engagement, right? And I think in order to do that, it really is around what's your business case, right? What's that value proposition? And understanding the need base for the corporation allows you to very tangibly connect what their need is, what they see the gap is to your value proposition. I cannot underscore how important it is to have a sponsor, an advocate to really move the needle for you, because like Meredith mentioned, the way that our structure is set up, it can be sometimes difficult to work on a small pilot because it's always a balance of what resources or what capital are you shifting towards that pilot versus something else. And then I think the other just piece of advice I would give startups is to be patient, right? You're dealing with big giants who are working on being agile and working on turning things around quickly, but the sheer process that we go through, the decision-making process that we need to go through, oftentimes it's not one person or one function or business that needs to approve, but it's a number of them. And so be patient, really make sure that you have a sponsor to help you navigate that space, and be very clear about not only your value proposition, but what you will hope to learn at the end of the pilot. And I think putting yourself in a corporation's shoe, right? Like, why should they choose you? Why should they work with you? What's that point of differentiation that you can really use to stand out? I think all of those are important.
I would also add just kind of like listening, flexibility, and kind of being willing to problem solve. Right? Yeah. And trying to kind of work with the person, work with your advocates on the corporate side to understand what are the barriers that they're running up against, and to problem solve around that, and being flexible around kind of, especially if you're early stage, the way that you get a pilot through doesn't necessarily need to be your end state exact business model, right? And so your first contract with the company might look different than your end state contract. You might have to be thinking about, okay, how can I reduce risk for this customer? What are the real risks that they're undertaking in working with me? And what am I willing to offer to make this less risky for them?
I think and I love a couple of things you guys brought up there, but one of the things I think startups often fail to do when they approach enterprises is actually put themselves in that enterprise's shoe. They tend to say, this is a multi-billion-dollar company. Why can't they just give me a $50,000 contract, right? And at the end of the day, you have to solve a pain point for that enterprise. Like, if you are not providing an ROI to that enterprise, there's no reason they should. They shouldn't do it just out of the goodness of their hearts, right? And so you have to understand not just what's the value to you as a startup by working with an Ecolab or a Cargill, what is the value that you bring to an Ecolab or Cargill? And it gets back to the thing that Meredith said at the very beginning around having an idea of how you might be able to partner. Oftentimes startups have an idea of how they might be able to partner, but it tends to be fairly one-sided. Like, ooh, we could have Ecolab do distribution for our product. how does that help Ecolab, right? How does that help Cargill? And they fail to connect the dot of how it helps that enterprise that they're trying to work with. And so I think that there's some really good advice there around preparing yourself and making sure that you know how you can help the enterprise. Two things I want to dig into a little bit further here. One is, should the startup be worried about their commercial readiness to work with you? So for example, like if I'm kind of like 50-50, this pilot's actually going to work or not on our side, do startups only get one chance? And if they fail, is it going to hurt them like forever? Or is it better to wait longer so they're more ready and then potentially dive in at that point?
That's a tricky question, Brett. I will offer a few ideas and welcome kind of pushback or countering perspective. I think that there's really one opportunity to introduce yourself to a corporation. Now, if things don't work out, or if you go in and say, hey, this is a beta, I'm trying to test and learn and pivot, I think it's important to set that up. But I think, at the end of the day, it's about communication and being very clear on your rationale for engaging. And if you have some concern about how ready your product is to commercialize, I think it would be better to kind of go and work out those kinks on your own before you come to a Cargill, because I will tell you, it'll be very difficult to go through that process and then say, okay, we've learned, we're going to come back to you a second time, because the memories run very long in corporations. And so I think if there are incubators or accelerators or other, call it low risk opportunities to continue to refine your technology, your product, your value proposition, I would encourage startups to use that as a learning pad versus engaging with a big corporation who really you have one shot to impress them, or one shot to show how you're going to solve one of their pain points, or one shot on why they should choose you versus a number of other competitors or startups that they may engage with. So Meredith, welcome your thoughts.
Well, I would definitely emphasize your point on that's kind of what accelerators are for, right? That's what accelerators are for. That's what incubators are for. That's what pitch days are for. That's what, some companies have specific facilities that they use to test new technology, new innovation. So I would just be thoughtful about who is that first corporate and what's the model under which you're testing with them. Because I think there's a lot more wiggle room in an accelerator program where that's kind of the understanding of all parties coming in versus going in with a full-on sales pitch as like part of an RFP, right? That's a totally different scenario, a different mindset that the people you're working with are coming in with. And those early stage programs are set up to ensure that the people that you're working with at the corporation understand the risks, and that you can have open and honest conversations around those without hurting your credibility. I would also say it kind of depends on the actual risks that a company is taking in working with you. If you are going to be, ripping out multi-million-dollar equipment of theirs from a facility, and if your stuff doesn't work, they've got a week worth of downtime, right? That's a different, you better be pretty solid by then versus, some sort of digital solution where you're not dealing with any, private information that you need to keep confidential, right? So it completely depends upon the innate or the natural risk level of the business that you're in as well.
Yeah, it's a hard one for me too. And I actually don't, because if you have the opportunity on your plate as a startup, you're like, I gotta go for it, even if it fails, right? In some cases, because you also run risk if you say, well, I'm gonna push it back. So it's a hard one for me, and I don't know the right answer. I do know for sure though, that sometimes startups get told no, And then a year later, it turns into a yes, though, right? So I do know, I've seen that happen where they haven't gotten that POC or that pilot, and because timing wasn't right, or honestly, your pitch wasn't right, or something wasn't right, or the enterprise was saying, oh, we're building this ourselves, but then a year later, all of a sudden, they're not building it themselves anymore, right? And so you never know with timing. So timing does matter. So continuing those relationships and continuing to check in and touch, have touch points does matter for sure. Dominique, it looked like you were about to say something on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I think it really boils down to clear goals and ambition and aspiration, right? Don't promise the world and under deliver. I think that's tough, but if you have those candid conversations with your corporate partner and say, hey, here's where I am in the process. Here's where I think I can add value. Here's where I'm still struggling a bit. At least they understand all the risk as well before saying yes or no, or before saying go or no go.
Yeah. One more thing that I wanted to kind of go dig a little bit deeper into this, and the sales piece of it is just any tips or tricks on how do you go from POC or pilot to commercialization, right? That's it's one battle to get that POC and get started and get the test. But then you have the second battle where you've now had a pilot or a proof of concept, POC stands for proof of concept, to go to actual commercial contracts. Best practices, anything startups should be thinking about on that side of things? Meredith, do you have anything?
I mean, in my line, as far as I'm concerned, a big piece of that is how did you deliver on the pilot, right? And then what's the revenue model, and were you actually testing the revenue model when you were testing the pilot, right? So it kind of becomes like, what is that additional barrier in how the pilot was designed versus the full-on commercialization model, and whether that was a different revenue model or whether it was a different type of facility, et cetera. But I think that's when the rubber really meets the road, right? It's a lot easier to kind of sell in a small dollar test. When the dollars get bigger, that's when your business case is really going to get tested. And so I'd say make sure you're gathering the data and the feedback that you need. And again, really, really listening. When I hear really smart startups talk about their engagement with companies, they're picking up on breadcrumbs that the companies are leaving behind as to the value that they're creating. And then they're thinking smartly about, okay, how do I monetize that value? And how do I take credit for the full value that I'm bringing to the company to help them scale up the dollar investment?
Yeah. I think what's top of mind for me is this notion of scalability, right? So where is a startup in their journey when they start the pilot, and then what does that scalability process look like? And one thing that I've seen is, yes, a startup can come in and do an awesome pilot, but when it comes to full production, full commercialization, kind of scaling up from pilot to commercialization, that oftentimes is just an area where they either don't have the financial capital or the knowledge base to really make that transition. And because I'm an optimist, I also think that that's an area where Cargill's and the Ecolabs can bring their knowledge of large scale commercialization to help support the startup if that pilot goes really well.
Yeah,
I think that the one thing I'll add is just this idea of having a plan, and this is kind of B2B sales tricks in general, right? Which is that if you can avoid asking for a yes and just take the yes as a given and keep moving along your plan, right? You kind of don't even give them a chance to say no. It's just, okay, well, first we'll get our results from the pilot, and then we'll schedule the next install, and right. So it's not like, okay, there's the pilot, we did great, now what, right? if you kind of lead them along without them even realizing it. Here's the next step.
I like that. I like that a lot, actually. But I think and I think that a lot of what both of you just said around being really good at expectation setting, matters a lot, and which digs into that. And I lied. I want to ask one more question about the sales stuff. How many people need to sign off on these things? Is it one person? If I'm a founder, should I be trying to talk to like 10 people at the same time to like all get them to buy into it? Should I be talking to just like my one key, that you mentioned, like your one key stakeholder that is your champion internally? Is that who I'm talking to? How do I navigate that part of it?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I'll be super transparent. One of my pet peeves is when a startup goes and emails like 15 people, right? And so, if you have someone who's a champion, who's a sponsor, really leverage that person, and that person should hold the responsibility of navigating and introducing you to the right people that may need to hear from you directly. That's just a personal pet peeve of mine. If I'm engaging with the startup and then I get like 3 or 4 notice from other folks who knows that I'm the point person, I just get really irritated. So if you have someone who has worked with you, who believes in your technology, who you trust, who's like shown their commitment, really leverage them and ask them those questions. Who else should I be engaging with? Who else needs to know about what I'm doing? Who are the key decision makers, and would it be helpful if I actually went in front of them and kind of told them about my technology or educated them on the process? And I think they'll be just a really good sounding board on who else needs to be part of the conversations. Because final sign off, it depends. I don't know about Ecolab, but I think every case is slightly different within Cargill, and as a corporate champion, they should be able to navigate that for you.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea of asking your corporate champion to, about the stakeholder management piece of it, right? To make sure that, because you do want to make sure that the person that you're working with is someone that is pushing things along and is someone that's making the right introductions. And so if you start to feel like you're on an island with them, right? Then I think, then's the time to kind of reassess who your person is. But as long as you trust your person and they've been making introductions and you feel like there's progress, I would, make sure not to burn that bridge if they're moving things along.
That's awesome. All right, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move to investment side just for a couple of quick questions as we get close to closing out here. And Dominique earlier today said that usually it's Series A and beyond, and I it's not a universal truth, but generally speaking, in talking with corporations, they are usually a little bit later stage, Series A and beyond type investors. So I don't think we need to dig into that too much. But I am curious, like, how do you all see the differences between, CVC, corporate venture capital, and traditional financial venture capital? What are the differences for a startup from taking money from an Ecolab or a Cargill versus taking money from like a Bread and Butter Ventures, the fund I run? Dominique, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think one of the, call it fundamental differences in my mind, is the opportunity to become a strategic partner, right? And so typically startups can find capital anywhere. Like there's so much money going into ag tech, food tech, you name it. There are a number of big VCs or family offices that are pouring money into the category. I think the real value of kind of corporates, and it's not the dollar amount, which is of course important, but it's the partnership, right? And it's the expertise and it's the knowledge base that they have to really add value to the company. And I think because of that, there's sometimes a double-edged sword, right? You want to add value, you don't want to have big corporations come in too early, but I do think long term, right? Corporations are set up where they can continue to invest in later rounds, but also continue to help grow the company as that company matures. And I think for me, that's one of the largest differences.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, there's, it can get quite philosophical, right, in terms of the right way or the wrong way for strategic investors to be strategic investors. And, you know, you could have long philosophical conversations over a beer one night, and there are much smarter people than I who have written articles on the topic. But I think it all goes back to kind of a theme that I'm hearing here, which is just having those open, honest conversations around the win-win, right? What are you looking for in an investor?
Yep.
Know what your top priorities are. Whatever they are, that's okay, right? Whatever your top priorities are, that's fine. If it's that you want to be a multi-billion-dollar company and IPO, great, right? If it's that you want, you know, a small business that you can run and pass down to your kids, totally different thing, also great, right? If you want to run this for a little while and then sell it to somebody, right? And so all of those different scenarios have different implications for the types of investors that you bring on board, both in terms of what your investors are going to get out of it, timelines, all sorts of things, right? And so I think the more that you know about what you want, which is always the hardest thing in life in general, right? But the more that you know about what you want, the more successful you'll be in finding a good investor match, and the more that you're willing to share that and be, you know, be honest about it and thoughtful about it, I think the better the investors and companies are able to match up.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to your point earlier, Meredith, on what's your plan, right? And so as you think about where you are today, and as you think about the next 5 years, what are those goals? What are those aspirations? And how do you build a syndicate or a cap table that really helps you achieve those goals? And I think understanding the value that each investor brings to the table and how those values work together is really important as a startup.
That's awesome. All right, and we're just about at time, so I'm going to go ahead and get us finished here with some closing thoughts. So have Meredith, why don't you give us your closing thoughts for the audience?
What I always like to remind startups of when they're working with corporates is that if you're able to engage with a corporate and start working with the right people within a company, you are very likely one of the favorite parts of their day, right? I mean, corporate employees love working with startups. You're working on the coolest stuff, you're energetic, you're you know, out there to take over the world, and we want to be a part of it, right? We want to be part of it from the corporate perspective, and we want to be a part of it as individuals, right? And so leverage that energy as much as you can, build those relationships, make the company feel like part of the team, and leverage us as part of the team, right? Because in the end, it can be a really phenomenal win-win for both parties.
I like that. For me, what I put down, I was like, be curious, right? And so be curious to learn about the corporation, learn about the ways that you can add value to them. Be open, right? And I think it's this notion, to Meredith's point, within the startup world, I feel like things are changing all the time, right? And so be open to that feedback, be open to that challenge from corporations. And then just the power of networking. I think some of the coolest engagements that I've had have been from startups that were willing to kind of tap into their overall cargo network, and it's gotten passed along to me. To Meredith's point, learning is a two-way street. And I think that there's so much value that startups can offer corporation around agility and speed to market and being bold and thinking big. And I think that there's a ton that corporations can add to startups, right? Around really being thoughtful in the engagement and how to grow their business and maybe unlock opportunities that startups may not have even known existed. So I do think that there's just great synergies, and learning is a two-way street.
Awesome. Thank you both. And I'll give one quick one as well. And I think it's just because you're a startup does not mean that corporations are obligated to invest in you or to do a POC with you. It is your job to figure out the value prop of what you bring to an enterprise or to a corporation. You have to provide value in return. They're not in this world to lose money on things that they do. So you have to provide an ROI. So being very thoughtful about your ROI story when you approach a corporation for a partnership. And it gets back to this whole story theme that we've been talking about today. So think really carefully about the value you provide them, not about the value that they can provide to you before you start talking with them. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Dominique, for joining us today. I enjoyed it. Hopefully you all enjoyed it too. Have a great rest of the Twin Cities Startup Week. Get out there. There's a lot of really cool startups in town. There's a lot of awesome events over the next couple of weeks. Thanks so much. Have a great evening.